As far as testimonial knowledge is concerned, a lot of it is, of course, testimonial knowledge, but we must also be aware that any knowledge that comes from a person, I may not treat it as knowledge. True, you know, but the whole question is whether, but it also becomes a bit dicey. Now, if we just take guessing as a means of knowing, then it is not a very reliable source. You see, it also depends on a lot on the way a question paper is designed. If the questions are such that it allows freedom of thought, if it allows freedom of application, then the student gets a scope to talk about one's own ideas in creative ways. I will explore the foundational concept of knowledge that we have had in philosophy and then proceed to see whether we can address the question of knowledge within the AI generated information system. So, what do we expect in in epistemic agents, as one might say, or a subject or a knower, and then what questions arise out of our journey to know something. So the fundament to start with the fundamental question or the basic question as to what is knowledge. Now in philosophy, the traditional account of knowledge is dependent on three conditions, and we often refer to that as a JTB condition: belief, truth, and justification. So these are the three necessary conditions that are expected to be satisfied when we talk about knowledge generation. So this is precisely the equation that we often see in philosophy textbooks, that knowledge is equal to justified true belief. So for an individual, let's say you, or a subject, to genuinely know something, as I said, it requires these three conditions. One clarification that I would want to make, that in the bracket, as you may see, that I have written, when I say something, it is about a proposition. Let's say I know that today is Friday. The medium to express whatever I know is always through a proposition. So the standard way of saying, which I will shortly point out, is always in a propositional form, which means it is in a sentential form. So when can we say that an individual, either we can call that individual a subject or a knower, that the subject knows something? For example, a proposition: Mercury is the closest planet to the sun. So if I have to say that X knows, or let's say Meena knows that Mercury is the closest planet to the sun. In a very abbreviated form, the generic form of this statement, of this question, is S knows that P. So when can we say S is the subject and P is the proposition that one claims to know? So the philosophical question is, when can one say that S knows that P, whatever the content of that P is? Now, philosophers would say, and this tradition started from Greek philosopher Plato, that we can say that S knows that P if and only if S believes that P. So there is always a belief factor. So the proposition that I claim, that I know, I must also believe in that proposition. So I must personally accept the proposition that there is a typo, Mercury is the closest planet to the sun. Because it is counterintuitive, because if you are, asked to think about it, you claim to know something, then you cannot say that I do not believe what I claim to know. It becomes extremely counterintuitive. So the first condition is that what I claim to know is also what I believe. The second is that what I believe, that P, has to be a true belief. It cannot be factually false. Let's say if someone says that S believes that Mercury is a rectangular planet, one may say that, of course, S is belief, but one also has to separate true belief from false belief. I can have many false beliefs, right? And I can entertain those false beliefs in myself, in my mind, but false beliefs cannot be knowledge, right? Because false beliefs at any point of time can be proven to be wrong. And that is the reason the first condition leads to the second condition, that if you know something, you have to believe that statement. That statement has to be a true statement, right? So it has to be a true belief. And the knower, or S, should have valid justification or evidence for P. So it has to be a belief, it has to be a true belief, and also it has to be a justified true belief. So that if someone asks me, why do you believe that the Mercury is the closest planet to the sun? I must have evidence or justification good enough to show that, look, this is why I believe that Mercury is the closest planet. So, just to begin philosophically, these are the traditional ways of defining, and that traditional way actually gives us three conditions which must be satisfied in order to say that something is a knowledge. And what is it to say that someone knows something? Now, what is the significance of this justification condition, the third condition that we propose? See, if any belief, and this is something that I want to bring it out and discuss later in a very commonsensical way as well, because you see, it is not just a philosophical account, it must also appeal to us. Why and when can we say that I know something, right? Now, so the third condition, which is the justification condition, right? Now, if someone lacks proper justification, then the belief may originate from superstition, or it may be just a guess for oneself, right? Now, if it is just a lucky guess, or if it is something that I derive from some sort of superstition, then that cannot provide a proper justification for my belief. And in that case, something that I believe because of a particular superstition, or because I just happen to make a lucky guess, cannot be called knowledge. So one must differentiate between genuine knowledge from lucky guess. For example, if you ask me about the number of participants in today's event from Uttarakhand attending this talk, right? And I say 5. And that happens to be the correct number of participants attending from Uttarakhand. Now, would someone say that I know that 5 people are attending from Uttarakhand? The answer would be no. The reason being that if I'm asked to say why I think that the number is 5, I will not be able to provide any justification for it. It might turn out to be true. Number 5 may turn out to be the correct number. So therefore, it turns out to be true. I believe that there are 5 people from Uttarakhand attending the talk. But definitely, just being true is not enough. It also has to be justified. So any lucky guess is not equal to knowledge. One more important distinction that we should draw or keep in mind, and this also we find from Plato onwards, is the distinction between episteme and doxa. Episteme is knowledge and doxa is opinion. When we talk about doxa, doxa is nothing but a common belief. And it comes from the Greek word dokian, meaning to seem, to appear, to think, to accept. Right? These are the different connotations of the word doxa. So, but when we talk, so doxa is formed or common beliefs are formed depending on what we see. Opinions are subjective. These opinions are easily revisable. They can be manipulated through persuasion, through argument, and may also lack proper reasons to hold that particular opinion, right? So these are the typical characteristics of any opinion or common belief. If I hold an opinion today, I might as well change that in the next 7 days. So these are extremely flexible, these are extremely volatile, and they are easily revised. But when we talk about knowledge, knowledge is more stable, it is more objective. It values truth and proper understanding. And it is often substantiated with adequate reasons and evidence. So if we see the characterization, we understand that, let's say, if I know that Mercury is the closest planet to the sun, and if it is a true justified belief, if it is an objective scientific fact, then I would expect that others can also entertain the same belief, the same knowledge, right? On the other hand, if I have an opinion, let's say about an event, about a person, it may happen that someone else or no one else shares the same opinion that I do. So, opinions or common beliefs can be extremely subjective, right? Whereas if a knowledge is true knowledge, then it is shared across individuals. It is shared across um, epistemic agents because it rests on justification, it rests on proper evidence, and therefore it is accepted not just by one, but by many. Now, we have seen what we started with is what is knowledge? How do we understand knowledge? And what are the conditions that are required for saying that someone knows something? And of course, we made a distinction between knowledge and opinion. Now, in our pursuit of knowledge, the question that we must reflect upon is, what does the knower stand to gain in one's journey, in one's epistemic journey or journey of knowledge? Right? We often hear, in common parlance, we often hear that, knowledge gives us a holistic development of the human mind, right? So, what is it? What is it that leads to that sort of development? So, the first thing that we can talk about is what we often call epistemic autonomy. Now, starting from childhood, we are in constant pursuit of gaining knowledge, right? To know. Basically, what we are actively involved is to know something. Now, this knowing something, right, or our efforts to know something is never passive in the sense that one is actively involved in gaining knowledge, right? So one has to make an effort to gain knowledge. And that effort is not physical, but it is also a cognitive effort. It's a mental effort to know to understand, to comprehend, to rationalize, to critically assess something. And this is all what this is all part of our the exercise to gain knowledge. So the first thing that we gain is an agency. We become active agents. And therefore, with this agency also comes the freedom to acquire knowledge. We are free to acquire knowledge, right? We cannot be restricted and be told that, look, you cannot know this, you cannot know that, in a very, literal sense of the term. There can be certain questions which are very difficult to answer, but that should not stop us from having the freedom to acquire knowledge about the things that we are interested in. And this acquiring of knowledge involves a process, involves an active cognitive process. And that is what constitutes the agency, and this freedom together constitutes our epistemic autonomy. The second, also, I think is very important, is epistemic responsibility. The more we know, the more we gather knowledge, it also allows the expansion of ideas, right? The more we know, the more we are aware. The more we know, we are aware of not only not only the expanse of knowledge, but also the limitations of it, right? And in this process of knowing, we are also navigating a very complex conceptual social givenness, right? There are concepts which are given to us. There is a certain kind of social milieu in which we grow up, right? So we are always exposed to certain cultural, social, conceptual givens, which we have to constantly navigate in the very process of knowing, right? In our journey to know. And that involves a certain sort of responsibility. Why responsibility? Because the more we know, the more we are aware, and the more we have to be responsible. Awareness about things should also entail certain kind of responsibility towards it. Right? So therefore, epistemic autonomy and epistemic responsibility becomes very important things that we gain out of our journey of knowledge. Plato, in his book, since I have been referring to Plato, I want to give an example from Plato's Republic. It is often known as the allegory of the cave, and this is how he shows us the difference between opinion and knowledge. He says that imagine a group of men is contained in a cave. They have never ventured out of the cave. They are chained inside the cave. So whatever they see inside the cave are nothing but reflections that come from outside into the walls of the cave. So I, as a resident inside the cave, can only see these reflections, right? So my knowledge of the world is from the reflections that I see, the images that I see, the shadows that I see on the walls of the cave. If one is freed from this captivity and walks out of the cave, then Plato says, he immediately experiences an immediate contact with the external world. So the man who frees himself and walks out of the cave sees the world. He is no longer captive to just experience the reflections on the walls of the cave. Now he can see things directly, he can experience them directly, he can know the things directly. The contrast this analogy refers in a way is that When I know the world only through the reflections of the images on the wall, I only have an indirect opinion. I have an opinion of what the world may be like, because the only thing that I see are shadows on the wall. So these are nothing but mere reflections from the world. Right? But the moment I step out, I'm in the world of gaining direct knowledge of of what the world is really like. So this is how he separates opinion from knowledge. He says that opinion and knowledge do not have the same status. Opinions can be mistaken, right? But knowledge is our pursuit towards truth. Knowledge has to be true. Knowledge cannot be false. So from this, if we get the analogy of the images, like seeing an image and seeing the object that creates that image, gives the distinction between knowledge and opinion. Now, let us get into the other part of the topic, that is AI, and we want to revisit the question of knowledge production. And is it important to separate information and knowledge? Now, what we know of knowledge generation in the age of AI, I do not work in the field of AI, but from what I read and what is happening in the world, in the way we see it, and the way we use AI systems, we have seen the transition, let's say, from expert systems to machine learning to large language models, which undoubtedly show enormous progress, not just in terms of massive possibilities of information generation, which is true that there are enormous possibilities in which knowledge can be generated, how such information is generated, and on the possibility of the ever extending ways of assistance we get in our search of knowledge. Right? The more we get, the more we discover as to the different ways in which we can get knowledge from the different AI systems. Right? So one cannot deny that massive progress has been made, enormous progress from where we started from. Because if we look at expert systems at the end of the day was an era where humans manually programmed explicit rules and logic into machines. Right? Now we have come to the age of large language modules, which in a way captures large amount of human knowledge across different concepts, different ideas, etc. So the possibilities have grown for sure. So is this the way we get information from different AI systems? Is it merely another source of knowledge generation over and above the other acknowledged sources of knowledge? So this is the question that we should reflect, that should we treat AI as just another AI systems to be another source that generates knowledge or generates information over and above the acknowledged ones. Now, when we talk about knowledge, let's say when we say that what is it to know, or if we put the questions very philosophically, if we ask what is knowledge, the other question we also ask is, what are the sources of knowledge? What are the sources? What are the avenues from which I can gain knowledge? Some of which are like our sense perception, could be visual, auditory, etc. It could be through inference. I can infer something new from my given set of information. Another kind or source of knowledge could be testimony. If I have to know something, I might go and visit an expert who, another person who, whose testimonial knowledge I believe. So testimony could be another source of knowledge. Now, the question is, what role does the cognitive agent, which means you or an individual, play in knowing? When we know something, when any individual tries to know something, there are certain cognitive tools that we constantly use. We may not be constantly aware of the tools that we are applying in each and every instance. But we do know that we try to comprehend, we try to understand, we try to deliberate, we try to argue, we try to see the logical connection, we do critical thinking, right? So an epistemic agent, a cognitive agent, is constantly engaged, mentally engaged, cognitively engaged when one is in pursuit of knowledge over passive acceptance. And this is a point that I want to drive very hard today, that whenever I see myself as an epistemic agent, as an individual who is constantly trying to gain knowledge about something or the other, my role is not just passive acceptance of whatever is there. Right? I engage with the content, I deliberate on it, I apply logical thinking, I try to see what makes sense, what doesn't. And if something doesn't make sense, I go over it over and over and over it so that I have a fair understanding of what I am reading. So it is something, your active participation is way more important in your pursuit of knowledge than just passive acceptance. So, knowledge generation in this age through AI system reflects a passive receptivity of information. And why do I say this? I say this because we assume that the system has already done the scanning, thinking, selection on behalf of the cognitive agent. So when I ask something on Google or when I use any AI tool to ask something, and I think that the answer is given to us on the question that I ask. You see, why do I accept it as an answer? Because I think this whole cognitive task, this cognitive um exercise of scanning through books, scanning through materials, deliberating on it, or going through it, then selecting the relevant portions, then making a coherent text, is something that is already done on my behalf. So now, as a recipient of that information, my role becomes extremely passive. And that is why I say that it reflects a certain sort of passive acceptance, passive receptivity of information. Now, the question is knowledge mere information? And this is a question that we have to ask ourselves because it's not a ready made answer. These are questions that one should reflect upon. We have to be extremely self critical, self reflective when we say that, I get everything from Google, I get everything from these AI systems. Of course, we do get things, but whether we at any point should make a demarcation and say that, look, information is not knowledge, or knowledge is not constitutive of mere information. Because when we talk about information, it is, of course, it looks very good because it's a structured, contextualized data depending on the question that you ask. So it looks very good because that is an immediate response to what I want. So it is out there, and we need mechanisms to integrate that data. But knowledge is internalized and it is assimilated by the knower in one's own cognitive ways, thinking, reasoning, critical reflection, right? Logical reasoning, etc., logical analysis. So now, if you try to see the difference that I'm trying to point out here, is when I say knowledge, when I say data, when I say information, it is out there in the external world. Anyone can access it. But let's say I start a research on a certain topic and I slowly progress reading from one book to the other to various other articles. Now, what I read is now transforming into the knowledge about that area because I am slowly internalizing and assimilating what I'm reading. Right? I'm trying to think, I'm trying to see what the text, how to make sense of the text, how to interpret the text. And the interesting point is that if two of us read the same book or read the same article, we might have completely different understanding of what the text is saying, right? So it is not just about being right or wrong. It is also about understanding something in one's own way. So my comprehension, my understanding is my own. Your understanding, your comprehension is your own. So it is not surprising that one may have different interpretations of the same text. And yet one may not score over the other by saying that this is correct, this is incorrect, unless we are talking about some, mathematical or logical solutions. So what we have in knowledge or knowledge generation is assimilation of information through proper cognitive reflections that translate information to knowledge. So what we read in a book may look like information, but we are translating that, we are assimilating that, and that becomes knowledge to us. So knowledge is internalized with an active epistemic agency. So this is what becomes important, that we overcome our passivity. Right? So when we are reading something, we are not passively reading it. We are actively engaging with the content of what we are reading. Gathering knowledge is translatable to the experience of an individual learner. Now, let's say my training in mathematics and your training in mathematics can give us two very different kinds of learning experience. You may enjoy mathematical training. I may not have enjoyed mathematical training. So our experience in learning something may also vary, and that reflects on the way we learn, what we learn, how much we learn, etc., etc. So knowledge production also takes us through a certain experiential journey where we can reflect, we can go back, and we can actually look back and think about how we learned mathematics, how we learned geometry, how we learned history. So the reason why I'm reiterating that knowledge production is not mechanical, it is not passive, because it carries an experiential training. There is a certain phenomenal experience that we go through in our years of training. And at any point of time, I can stop, I can pause, I can reflect, I can go back, and I can say, okay, look, whatever I learned in this may not be the correct thing. So I can keep self-correcting my learning as well. So that is what makes this whole exercise of knowledge extremely interesting and alive for us. Now, if we read something passively, if I just ask an AI tool to generate an academic paper for me, I would know that probably it has gone through several sources and created a good paper for me. But have I learned anything from that paper? Have I really reflected? Is my reasoning, is my conceptual ideas reflected in that? I guess one can easily say that, there is a difference when you write something on your own and when something is AI generated, no matter how accurate in terms of information it may be. So, coming back to the question of then what happens to the process of justification and truth condition? If we say that, look, the things that we get from Google, we get from different AI systems, is after all information, and it has been done through proper search mechanisms which are embedded into the system. The question is, have we learned the justification? Are we transparent about on the process of justification, which takes us from step 1 to step 2 to step 3 to step 4, and therefore conclude that, okay, S believes that P. And then what happens also to the truth condition? How do I claim that this is true? What is my basis of saying that this is true? And of course, with the challenges that we face is of something being fake, gives rise to this question of what is true, right? Over and over again. So, how is the gathered information justified? How can, how can we establish the truth about any generating information? As a cognitive agent, how do I do that? The other important aspect which one has to reflect if one sees oneself as an active social agent, epistemic agent, what happens to our phenomenal and social experiences? What happens to the things that we experience on a regular basis, the social experiences, the cultural experiences that we go through? That is also constitutive of the ways we look and interpret the world. Right? So the way I treat another individual, the way I see the social events unfolding, and the way I see different kinds of events, political, historical, social events, right? What happens to those experiences that I gather over the years? What role do these experiences play in ways of knowledge acquisition? So, probably these questions will help us reflect that knowledge is perhaps not mere information. Information is not something that would wholly constitute our endeavor for knowledge generation. So the few questions that I would, raise and probably stop here is, in this age of AI and over our increasing dependency on AI systems, where do we ourselves locate our epistemic agency? Who is the epistemic agent here? Who is generating the knowledge? Is it the system generating knowledge for us? Therefore, the system becomes the agent? Or is it the freedom? You see, the question that I raised earlier. So, is the epistemic agency and the epistemic freedom still epistemic responsibility, still resides on us? Because it is our pursuit to know something. And, or if we have to kind of shift the question of epistemic agency onto an AI system, then the question that we should ask ourselves seriously is, then what would be the nature of epistemic agency in AI systems? How and in what ways does an AI system become an epistemic agent, an active epistemic agent?
So, while you were having the discussion, you talked about testimonial knowledge. So, do you think that isn't the knowledge that we have mostly is testimonial, as we haven't observed things directly. As for example, our planet. We haven't observed it directly. So, do you think that the knowledge we already have is testimonial?
Well, I would say that, of course, when we have knowledge about the world, there is an immediate, physical world that is presented to our sense perception, uh, for which we can use our sense modalities. But as far as testimonial knowledge is concerned, a lot of it is, of course, testimonial knowledge, but we must also be aware that any knowledge that comes from a person, I may not treat it as knowledge. Let's say you are, if I go to someone who I don't trust, so there is a lot that goes on um, in deciding the source of testimonial knowledge. Right now, testimonial knowledge can also take various forms. Let's say if someone writes a book about one's own research, then that becomes a part of shared wisdom, that becomes a part of testimonial knowledge. But testimonial knowledge is not just limited to books, it is also limited to, let's say, if I have to know something, then who do I ask? Right? So, who is an authoritative person to give me uh, the right knowledge, right, or the correct knowledge? So, selecting whom we approach or what is the correct source of testimonial knowledge becomes very important. So it's not that the whole of knowledge is testimony.
Okay. So we have a question from our director, Professor Dr. Varghese Pandulugaran. So the question is, just like the process of deduction and induction for knowledge production, do we not have abduction, justified guess as a process to gain knowledge, which is closer to the approach of AI systems?
Mm, can you reread the question once more for me?
Yeah, sure, ma'am. So just like the process of deduction and induction for knowledge production, do we not have abduction, justified
Mhm.
guess, as a process to gain knowledge, which is closer to the approach of AI systems?
Well, we often do guess, right? And often that guess might turn out to be a lucky guess, and it may turn out to be uh, true, you know. But the whole question is whether, but it also becomes a bit dicey. Now, if we just take guessing as a means of knowing, then it is not a very reliable source. Now, when we talk about gaining knowledge, then guessing is not probably a reliable source of, we may use it. We may use guess, we do guesswork, but that cannot be counted as a reliable source of knowledge. That's the difference that we have to make, because it might be true, it might be false. Now, this contingency is something that we do not want when we want to know something. So, it as a matter of application, we do, but in terms of reliability, because guessing is not infallible. Fallibility is another condition, right? So, that is not infallible. It might mislead us.
Okay, ma'am. So thank you for answering that. And we have a question from Kshamadam. There are different age group of educators. What is the best way for them to become AI savvy?
Hmm, I'm not quite sure if I can answer that, because I'm not in the exercise of training, in the sense that I teach, but I do not really. So my answer would be from a very general perspective. You see, the point is that eventually one chooses the way that suits one's knowing, you know. So becoming AI savvy is a matter of training. Now, what training one must take up depends on probably the area of research that one is doing, which probably I'm not the right person to suggest, the ways of selecting the AI way to learn something. For me, everything even now is textual. It's through discussion, it's through deliberation, it's through, you know, active participation, argumentation. That is how we learn, and that is precisely our mode of classroom teaching. Because I want the student to be involved, to be cognitively involved, not be dependent. This epistemic freedom should not lead us to a technological dependence, right? It can be an aid. AI systems can be an aid, but it cannot be a dependence which make us extremely weak, cognitively weak. If I have understood the question correctly.
Okay, ma'am. So we have another question from Ravi Kumar. How to use AI for minimalism as we are living in the AI age?
Well, there is no general formula as to how we can do it, but the point is through more and more awareness of what the dependence on AI, where will the dependence on AI lead us? And is it the place where I want to be in another 10 years? You know, so it is more of self awareness, it is more of being self reflective of where I want to be and how I want to get there. So this whole, um, this whole idea as to how much is minimum use is also variant. What is minimum for me may not be minimum for someone else. So it's very difficult to define a generic way. One can think of avoiding it, but there are certain limitations which people give into. There are certain sorts of weaknesses, cognitive weaknesses, that we often face as challenges, but this can alone come from self reflection.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you. So we have last question. So Hamandi Panda Mukherjee has asked, how can a student utilize their creative knowledge and apply their own ideas during an exam, even if they wish to sit for it without having read the textbook?
Mm, you see, it also depends on a lot on the way a question paper is designed. If the questions are such that it allows freedom of thought, if it allows freedom of application, then the student gets a scope to talk about one's own ideas in creative ways. But let's say if a question paper is based on a text, specific to the content of a text, then there are hardly ways in getting very creative about it. What one can do is have the question paper in a way that even if it is dependent on a text, one can always ask a student about his own ideas, her own ideas, or whether one agrees with it. So I remember that the ways in which teachers would, make us reflect on a text is always to add a question, add a sub question by saying that what do you think? What is your opinion? How do you agree with this philosopher? Or what would be your argument if you have to argue against such a position? So it allows some space for free thinking, for creative thinking. One should not be only text bound either.